Hello and welcome back to PolyToots. In today's video we are continuing with the creation of this Jeep, and today's video is all about the UVs, which I know is everybody's favorite topic. We will kick it off with a little introduction to UVs as a concept, so if you're already familiar, feel free to skip to the next chapter. As for everyone else, let's talk about UVs for a bit. So we have here the default cube, and over on the left there, we have the default UVs that you get with the cube. And if you're looking at the shape of this and thinking, like, wow, that looks a lot like a flattened out version of that box, then you would be correct, because that's essentially all UVs are. It's like you're taking your 3D mesh and you have to make some cuts in order to flatten it out, because of course textures are just 2D information. So, we need a way to map what is 2D onto what is 3D. And there's really only three things to consider as like a base for doing good UVs. The first is to keep seams to a minimum. The second is to keep distortion to a minimum. And the third is to use as much of the UV space as you can. And so by seams, what I'm referring to are these cuts that you have to make, usually in order for you to unfold your mesh into this 2D layout. And when we talk about distortion, we are essentially referring to the shape of each of these faces on the 3D object and how that correlates to the shape of the faces on the UVs. The cube example, for example, is completely perfect. So there is zero distortion happening anywhere here. But if I were to just grab any of these faces and start to move them around, you can see that the face we're moving, which is this one up here, although we are offsetting the texture, it is retaining the shape. Whereas because now we're pulling the verts of the other ones, we're getting, lots of skewed stuff happening. So that's distortion, which is to be avoided. And in terms of using as much UV space as you can, obviously, this is the UV bounds, and the idea is just, try and fit what you can, like as tightly packed within here. And although you could do a better job with these UVs that we have, there's also nothing wrong with them. And I think this kind of touches on a little bit as to why people typically don't like doing UVs. In that, there are these rules that people are telling them that they have to follow, like you have to keep seams to an all-time low, distortion needs to be kept to an all-time low. I mean, these two rules by themselves conflict with each other, like two bosses at work screaming opposite instructions at you. Sometimes it just doesn't make any sense. You will have to use more seams in order to reduce distortion. So to close this off, we'll just look at two more examples here. The default sphere, as you can see, does use as few seams as possible. It's really only on the top and bottom poles that it has cuts along the edges. And it is absolutely maximizing UV space, but of course at the cost of massive distortion. So I have this other example sphere here where I've introduced some seams. You can see them highlighted in red on the 3D mesh. The UV space usage has taken a bit of a hit, but we have improved the overall distortion. And personally, for me, I would prioritize more seams if it meant reducing distortion, but seams in general has a few sub rules, nothing crazy, but we'll talk more about it later. In fact, hopefully very soon, because we might as well just jump straight onto the Jeep right now. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to want to do is pop ourselves over to the UV editing tab. And here we have the UV editing window, and we also have the shader editor down here, which we don't really have much use for right now, but it might come up later, so let's just leave it where it is. And then in the 3D view, you can see that our render mode has been set to material. This is handy for some things, but mostly when you're doing UVs, you don't want to be staring at a bright white model. So I'm going to hold down Z and switch this back into solid. And because it looks really nice, I'll come up here to the viewport shading menu and re-enable our cavity. Now, we have quite a lot to get through, so let's select the largest piece of our Jeep, and I'll hit the / key to isolate it. And then get ourselves into edit mode with tab. We do still have the mirror modifier applied, which is handy if you want to also mirror your texture detail and save space on the UVs. So let's select everything, and I'll show you the laziest and yet handiest way to unwrap an object. So we'll press U, and we'll choose Smart UV Project. And we have some options here. The two most important ones are the angle limit and the island margin. Angle limit is going to check our edges for hard angles of connected polygons, and it will split the islands based on that. But as you can see, nothing's happening when we change this. So if you're more of a visual learner, what you can do is just hit Unwrap. And then if you come to this little menu that's collapsed itself, just open it up. And now we can adjust the angle limit and see the updates in real time. And if we were to go all the way to 0, it's going to split out our faces into loads of little islands, which is really not ideal. Although it's not one of the direct rules, you do want to try and have as few islands as possible, but we get that by reducing seams, so rule number 1 still applies. It also just makes working with UVs a lot easier because you can actually tell what islands correspond to on your 3D model, instead of having random split faces everywhere. So something to keep in mind for sure, don't go too high, don't go too low. The Goldilocks story has prepared us all for this. I'm also going to increase the island margin because right now all of these UVs are touching each other, which can cause texture bleeding from one side into the other. So let's just hold down the Shift key here, and I'll slowly increment this just to give it a little bit of breathing room between the islands. And honestly, as lazy as this smart UV project is, it can provide like a really good base for when you're working with hard surface objects. It does not perform well when you're working on organic or generally more curvy stuff. And of course, some of the drawbacks is that you don't have any control over where your seams are. And because of that, even with quite a high angle limit, we're still getting these individual faces which are being split out, which don't really make any sense. So, you know, all in all, it is handy, but it can make working with UVs visually confusing as well. If you don't care like at all about nice UVs, then you could get by with just the smart UV project. But, and I'm not just saying this to try and keep you watching the tutorial, I will say that if this is all you know how to do, you are going to find yourself in a lot of trouble later, because there's always going to be something that needs to be fixed or changed in some way, and you won't know how to do it. So let's keep this as it is, and then we'll talk a little bit about how we can improve this and tidy it up. So the main thing to look out for at this point after an auto unwrap is to get all of these smaller islands and see if we can attach them onto their larger counterparts. It's worth noting that just like in edit mode, we do have the ability to select verts, edges, faces, and entire islands. You may have noticed though that as we're making these selections, we can't actually tell what they represent on the 3D model, and this doesn't really help us try to tidy any of this up. So that's where UV sync selection comes into play, and we can enable this up here. And if you're coming from other 3D software, this is probably what you're most used to. Now anything that we select on the mesh will show up on the UVs, and vice versa. The only thing worth pointing out right now is that we've lost the ability to select islands for reasons unknown to me, but we can just press L to select them instead. We also need a good visual way to check for distortion, especially if you're new to this whole thing. And while there are some overlay methods here in the UV window, like stretch angle or area angle, I personally don't ever use these. By all means, feel free though. For me, I just rely on my eyes and a good old checker texture. So let's go to the material tab here. We'll press new, and it immediately adds the material onto whatever you have selected. Let's just rename this to checker. And now you see our shader editor has been populated with some nodes. So let's come down here and press Shift A to search, start typing image, and put down an image texture node. Connect the color to the base color, and then press new. You don't have to rename the texture, it doesn't matter, but on the generated type, change this to UV grid. Resolution also not super important, you can just leave that as it is. Now press new image, and we get this checker texture here. I do not want the preview to be on the UV background though, because it's just impossible to see anything, so I'll press this little X, and now over on the model, if we hold Z and we switch back into material preview, we can see the checker texture here. And if you remember from the intro, what we're looking out for is just like, are these squares still square? And right now everything has been unwrapped based on hard edges. So, you know, yes, everything is fine distortion wise. but there are definitely more seams than there need to be. Like, we can tidy this up. For example, if I just select this wheel arch, you can see this is split into 3 pieces on our UVs. No need for that. So we'll use the most common unwrap method by pressing U, and it's the unwrap angle based. This is the one you'll be using probably 90% of the time, unless you only do automated UVs. So we'll choose this. It will always try to fit whatever you unwrap to the border of the UVs, which is fine. We'll worry about the scale of everything like later on. Right now, we just want to get it unwrapped. And now we'll come over to this area here where we can select some of these, something like that. So if you were to try this and you press U and you go to unwrap angle based, you can see that it is giving us something, but that something should strike you as a little odd in that the shapes of these UVs here don't really match up with the shape of the polygons that they're supposed to be representing. And if you go and check the material preview, you can see that we are getting distortion. Like, the angle is not a massive concern, but when you start to see the squares wibble a bit too much, that's usually something to look at fixing. So one thing you can do is get this section here and unwrap it on its own. It's just a flat piece. And then with this one, this is still going to be a problem unless we add in a cut. So think about this as if it was a piece of cardboard that you're desperately trying to fit into the recycling bin. Like, where would the pressure points be? Like, if you were to try and flatten this out so it fits, where would it rip when you stomped on it? That's how I like to think about UVs. And it's probably these edges right here. So we can press U and go to mark seam. And that lets the UV editor know that we plan to cut this right there. So I'll come back here and select all of this element again, and I'll press U and then unwrap angle based. And now you can see, let me just scale it down a bit. It's a much tidier unwrap. And if we check our distortion, everything's fine. Like, these squares are about as perfectly square as they can be. So everything's happy, everything's good. I know that these UVs are all over the place, but we'll talk about the scaling and packing at the end. For now, what would happen if you did want most of the UVs mirrored, but to have parts of it unique? This part, for example, like you want some numbers or something on here, but you don't want those to be mirrored on the other side because that would be, you know, backwards numbers. The answer is that you will need to apply the mirror modifier, so make sure that you have actually finished unwrapping this piece. And now in edit mode, we have access to both sides of geometry. From here, it is as simple as you just select the pieces that you want to be unique. You don't have to re-unwrap them. But if you were to try and move them with UV sync selection enabled, you can see it's going to stretch, which you can see in the material preview as well. It's going to be an absolute mess. So you can turn off the UV sync selection and just move it. And now when we turn it back on, it's completely detached. That's just an example if you did want to do that. For me, and for the sake of actually finishing this tutorial, I'm just going to keep it simple and I'll leave it as it was with the mirror modifier on. As for everything else, I should point out that when it comes to using the common angle-based unwrap method, you don't need to do it little by little. If we grab a tire here, for example, we only need to grab one because they're all instances. You can actually just mark all of your seams on the object and then unwrap it in one go. We have a good base here for some seams based on where we have these edges marked as sharp. We don't have to do all of them as seams, but what you can do is click on one of the sharp edges, press Shift-G to select similar, and then choose sharpness, and that will select all of the sharp edges that we had marked. If we were to mark all of these as seams, it would be the same as choosing the Smart UV Project that we discussed earlier. So what I'm going to do, actually just before that, I'm going to make this easier to see by disabling the visualization of the sharp edges. I'm going to come back to the tire and use Control-Shift-Click on some of these loops to deselect them. For example, on the back, I'm not too fussed about it, like that could just be one group. The rim we'll have as one. It's up to you, honestly, like at this point, there's no right or wrong. I'll also add in a seam here and across here so that these pieces can actually unfold. And if you press U, mark seam, they should all unwrap nicely without us having to unwrap it section by section. So let's grab everything, unwrap angle based, And now we've got the whole tire unwrapped. And actually, to counteract the whole do it in one go that I'm harping on about, I do like to group these kind of cylindrical pieces. This is a personal preference. So I'll clear the seam on this edge here, and then just unwrap that on its own. So now I have one island for that part instead of two. Remember that we are going to cover scale and packing later, so don't stress. The next thing that I want to talk about is the Solidify and UVs. So if you remember, on a few of these pieces, we added the Solidify modifier. I think there's some on the back as well. Let's just isolate this for clarity. Now the actual geometry that we can unwrap is just what we modeled. Oh, let's get backface culling back too. So this is the only geometry that we have. Everything else is virtual geometry from the modifier that we don't have direct access to. So if we were to just put in a seam here and unwrap this whole object, we just get that single unfolded side, and the geometry from the modifier is nowhere to be seen. So what you do need to do is apply this modifier, and now you have access to all of the geometry. You will at this point need to mark up some more seams, and usually it's just a case of splitting out the thickness that we got. If you're ever not sure if your seams are any good, just do an unwrap and check it out. Like, take a look at the UVs and see if they make sense with the object. The last two things that I want to show you would be best demonstrated on these railings. So we have this long, annoying piece here, and also these three, which arguably could be the same. We'll split out the end cap by marking all those outer edges as seams, and then we'll use Shift-Alt and click on a loop for the big pipe, mark all of that as a seam, and then for these ones we'll just click once, sort of somewhere like in the center-ish. They already have their end caps removed. Now we can just select everything, unwrap angle based, and we can see here, you know, it has tried to straighten up this pipe, and we do have these individual little pieces as well. The interesting thing about these is they share the exact same topology. So what you can actually do is if you just select all of one, press Ctrl C to copy, and then select all of another one, Ctrl V to paste, and then repeat that on this last one. And so now all of these occupy the same UV space. One of them was a little smaller, so it did scale up to fit, but that's fine. If you wanted this longer pipe to be straight, which is a common way to unwrap pipes, what you can do is select the whole pipe and then just come along and find a flat face somewhere. So we'll hold Shift, select the piece to deselect it, and then Shift select again to mark it as the active quad. And then we can press U and choose Follow Active Quads. You can choose either even length or length average, but length average is usually the winner chicken dinner. And as you may have noticed there, this is now straightened up quite a lot. You will sometimes have to rotate it a bit to get it perfectly angled on the UV sheet. You don't have to do this manually though. You can go to UV Align Rotation, and it does try to snap it to the closest rotation that it was already at. So if we just line this up on the edge here, you can see it's as straight as can be. And so yeah, I mean, that's that, honestly. Like, outside of add-ons, that's like 99% of what you need to know. So I'm going to skip to the end game now, where we'll cover how to scale the islands correctly and pack it all down ready for texturing. Alright, so here it is with all pieces unwrapped, randomly placed, and all the wrong scale. We'll need to sort out the scale first, and what I mean by that is if I were to select, for example, the main body here and also these instruments on the dash, you can see that the instruments are huge compared to the main body. So to fix the scale, the first thing that we're going to want to do is actually make sure that the scale of all of our objects is set to 1. You know that thing I kept banging on about in the modeling videos? So I do have a few pieces here where that's not the case. And maybe there's some areas that I don't know about as well. So what I'm going to do is just select everything except the wheels, because the wheels are instances and we cannot apply scale to instances, which is unfortunate. But let's just select our wheels to begin with, because there's only 5 of them, and then I'll press Ctrl and I to select everything else. Then Ctrl A and we'll apply the scale. And now everything is at a scale of 1. So now I can tap A to grab everything, come into edit mode with tab, select all of our UVs, go to the UV menu and choose average island scale. And it looks a bit crazy. It looks like everything's gone wrong, but all that's done is just scaled up our UVs up or down to match the relative scale on our object. And now with that out of the way, we can go to UV and choose Pack Islands. Concave is probably the one you want. It's going to treat the island borders as you see it. So you know this area here on the windshield, it has like space in the center. So if something can fit inside that, it will try to pack it inside that. If you had to choose convex or bounding box, that's not going to happen. Leave the scale on. This just means it will fit inside the UV bounds. It's not going to randomly scale things as it wishes. We do have some options for handling the rotation. Personally, I don't bother with that because as I'm unwrapping each piece, I usually have the rotation the way that I want anyway. And then merge overlapping. We're actually going to leave this disabled because Blender treats all of these UVs that are intersecting with each other as overlapping, and we definitely don't want to merge those. So I'll click Pack, and here we go. Now, by not choosing merge overlapping, we still have half of the Jeep here, which is fine because the other half is still being handled by the mirror modifier, which is perfect. So we don't have unique UVs split out for that. But if you remember, we had some areas like these little pieces that we did manually. Those have unfortunately been made unique because we had to pack it with overlapping disabled. Though in hindsight, they do take up a tiny, tiny amount of space. But if you did want to, you could get these again and just copy, paste, paste, and there you go. There's your UVs overlaid again. The other thing is the distance between all of these islands is way too big for now, so we can definitely make some savings there. And also for the underside, like this chassis area, I'm going to press L and make sure you're set to UVs rather than normal on the linked selection. That way it will restrict the selection to the UV seams. And I'm going to select everything that I think could be a much lower priority in the texture. Then I'll come to the UVs window and scale it down. Select everything again by tapping A, and I'll go to Pack Islands again, and I'll change the margin now because it's big. Maybe down to 0.6 or something, and pack that again. And there we go. It's looking much nicer now. The last thing we should do is to make the Jeep one object, which will help with the texturing that we'll be doing. You can absolutely have individual objects using the same material and just sort of texture each piece as you go. But I think for this and for a lot of stuff that I do, I'm just going to start with it as one object and then split it out later if I need to. Since we'll be joining everything up, we need to get rid of these mirror modifiers, because if we were to, for example, try to join this wheel up to the body with Ctrl J, we're going to get two steering wheels because it's keeping the mirror modifier. So let's just undo that. I'll press A to grab all, right click and choose Convert to Mesh. This applies all of the modifiers on all of the objects. With everything still selected, you can press Ctrl J to join. Sometimes this won't work if you don't have like an active selection, which is confusing, I know, but if that happens to you, then just shift click on something like the main body so that it becomes the active one. Then Ctrl J to join, done. And so now we have one object that's fully unwrapped and ready to be textured. And if you want this exact same model in its current state, it is available over on my Patreon for free if you wanted to start the texturing video at the same place as what we have it here. But yeah, for this video, that's it. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the final video.